Politics 101. I am David Hines, of course, and today, the day after, the morning after, yesterday was the 23rd, our Republic anniversary, and we have been talking a lot this week about republicanism and what that has meant or not meant for Guyana. It has allowed us to talk about some things that we would not normally talk about. It has allowed us to situate ourselves in a larger context than we would normally do. It has allowed us to reach for a history that may seem long ago, but in many regards, it's recent history. So in a sense, the discussion this week on republicanism has allowed us to speak about and to a Guyana in its more profound context. And we're going to continue to do that this evening by looking at Forbes Burnham, who would have been 99 years old on the 20th, and who remains, along with others, as one of our great products. And I want to say something here as we move in to talk about Burnham, and to say that one of the failings of our republic is our inability to look at our own history in very holistic terms, that we get bogged down with looking at our world through the prism of the party. And in doing so, we miss a lot of what the party doesn't represent, because the political party, while it's an important institution, it's a limited institution. And it doesn't allow us always to engage in the broad scope of things. And we get trapped in the notion of us versus them. And so we look at our reality through us and we exclude them. So therefore, we spend sometimes our whole life not being conscious about the world around us, outside of us. I have spoken on this program so many times about us not being conscious of a world around us. And we've been talking a lot this week about the USAID report coming from the Americans. We have been talking a lot about the message from the United States president. We've been talking about Mr. Su, and I've been trying to make the point that the convergence of those three interventions allows us to look at our recent politics in its global context. Because the 2020 elections, we saw it as PPP versus the coalition, and that's a narrow context. But that election had broader context. And one may ask, why is Joe Biden interested in Guyana? Why is Joe Biden interested in inclusion in Guyana? Why is the USAID interested in Guyana having power sharing? Why are they interested in Guyana having a national development strategy? Or why are they interested in cash transfers in Guyana? Why? Why are they minding our business we may ask, well, our business is not just our business. Our business has never been our business alone. It has always been tied up in things far away from us and not so far away from us. And as Guyanese, we have to overcome that weakness. Slavery was not a Guyanese phenomenon. It was a global phenomenon. In fact, as I've explained on this program so many times, slavery was the first phase of globalization. What we're calling globalization today is just the latest phase. Our foreparents they were not enslaved as individuals. And they were enslaved as people who belong to a particular ethnic group. And so today we are going to continue our discussion. When we talk about Burnham, half of our population look to Burnham as a hero. And you can't deny communities their heroes and heroines. Part of what animates human beings is that they want to be identified with things that they see that are positive. So we're going to be talking about Burnham tonight. I'm not interested in beating up on Burnham. I beat up on Burnham a lot when I was a little boy. Been there, done that. One evolves, one takes into consideration our history. So I'm not interested in beating up on Burnham. I'm also not interested in deifying Burnham. That is turning Burnham into some god who never made a mistake. What I'm interested in is using the phenomenon called Burnham to try to understand this project that Guyana, and by extension, the Caribbean, is involved in. This project of repairing. Because what slavery did, and colonialism and indentureship did, was to damage. And since independence, since 1966, and before that, I would argue from the 1930s when the last phase of decolonization took root, the 1930s disturbances. Since the 1930s, we've been engaged in this project of repairing. And I think often when we talk about Burnham or Jagan or Rodney or whoever, Guyana and whoever else, we often talk about them detached from a reality. And the reality is that one has to, if one is to understand the significance of a Forbes Burnham, one has to not detach him from his time, but to attach him to his time. What was happening in Guyana? What was happening in the Caribbean? What was happening in the world? Burnham was born in Guyana, not Virginia. That makes a difference, a big difference. Because Guyana is a particular type of society. And so tonight I want to talk about Mr. Burnham, not to beat up on Burnham. So I know some of y'all anti-Burnham people are going to be very present tonight, and I start very early. If y'all come here to hear me beat up on Burnham, please go somewhere else. I'm not interested in that. And I know a lot of Burnhamites are in the audience. And if you all come here to hear me praise Burnham or try to get the panelists here tonight to praise Burnham as a god who never was a human being, who never was the product of a society around him, and who never make mistakes, you all go somewhere else. I think these are serious times that demand serious discussion. You know, I just tell you all, I love you all Guyanese, I love you all Black people, I love you all Indian people, but sometimes you all send me crazy because you all just want to talk about small things, or you all want to talk about big things in small ways. So tonight we're gonna lift we game as we always endeavor to do on this program. So welcome everyone down to Politics 101. And we're going to be talking about FOBS Burnham. FOBS Burnham at 99. Let everyone know the program has started. And we have, I think, people tonight who are able to talk about Burnham, two people who know Burnham well because they work with him, they work close to him, they admire him. And then we have a younger man who may not have even, I don't think he ever met Burnham. No, he's a little boy. But he's a young man who has had an interest in Burnham and brings that youthful perspective to discussion. Last night, you know, we had a young man on, young Elson Lowe, and you know, he brought a youthful perspective to the discussion, not always a perspective that sat well with the older people on, Akumo Gunse and Kathy Hughes, but they were both understanding of a young man engaging our subjects from the standpoint of young people. Welcome everyone. Let's roll. My guest tonight, Hamilton Green. No introduction, none whatsoever. I think if there are on the 18 people in this audience, I would be scandalized if I have to introduce Hamilton Green. I will say nothing more than to say, welcome, Brother Hammy, to the program. Vincent Alexander, welcome, Vincent. And those of you who know this program, who know contemporary Guyana, Vincent knows no introduction. I'm not going to spend any time introducing Vincent. If you all want that, go do your homework. Brent Benjamin, he needs introduction. Young man, he's a lecturer at the University of Guyana. He specializes in Caribbean studies, Caribbean political economy, and he does some history. The young people today, you all know that unlike our generation where we specialized, the younger scholars these days don't specialize. They do intersections, and they are multidisciplinary. Dwayne Benjamin, lecturer at the University of Guyana. Gentlemen, welcome to Politics 101.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much.
Let me start with you. And what I want you to do is introduce Burnham to the young person and not so young person in this audience who did not live through the early years of independence, but would have heard the name Burnham. Introduce Burnham to such a person for us. We're getting a feedback from somebody. Yes, go ahead, Ami.
There's no feedback here.
Okay, you go ahead, Ami.
Sorry?
Oh, go ahead. You heard my question?
No, I didn't hear you.
Oh, what I want you to do is to introduce Burnham to the young person, the not so young person, the person who didn't live through the 50s and the 60s, who knows Burnham, heard about Burnham, but He's just a great man. But I want you to support Burnham in historical context for that young person.
Thank you, David. First, I take account of your introductory remarks. Burnham was a human being, weaknesses and strengths. Let me begin with the weakness that I perceived of Forbes Burnham, who I knew long before he entered the political arena, being part of the Sampson family, and who had to ensure that he spoke to my mother before he left for England. Burnham was a colossus in many ways, but I believe he was an impatient person and couldn't take the time to allow ordinary mortals to catch up with his ideas, which were revolutionary, unique, and different at that time. I begin with that weakness I perceive. His great strength was as commander-in-chief either of the party or in government. He had a unique ability to pick the right generals for the correct job and assignment. He knew what a battalion had to do, and he had an uncanny ability to identify such persons to lead that battalion or brigade to victory. Burnham, by any stretch, was a brilliant man. And for the young people who may be listening, you need to appreciate Burnham's political career in the context of what was a very vicious, treacherous, and dangerous Cold War. We cannot analyze Burnham and Jagan unless you have an understanding of the depth, the intensity, and the all-consuming power of a Cold War, where two superpowers were seeking to get friends, east, west, north, and south, on their side. This struggle, this Cold War, cost millions of lives in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. For me, Burnham had the skill to navigate those treacherous waters and remain in place until he died in 1985. My analysis is that the two men who survived the Cold War were Forbes Burnham and Fidel Castro, in different circumstances, but very similar. There was a missile crisis. There's our crisis in 1957, when that ugly, distasteful racial slur of Apanjat surfaced. Burnham had to deal with that was opposing for the sake of opposing. Burnham had to deal with the giants in this part of the world who felt it was their duty to control this part of the globe. I'm speaking about the mighty United States of America. It was not easy. And therefore, in 1972, when a few of us, literally a few of us, supported Burnham, and as an example, to recognize the People's Republic of China, it was the work of a brave man who had the audacity to say that we feel it is our duty to recognize the People's Republic of China. When his other colleagues in the Caribbean were reluctant, some may say afraid, to embrace the whole concept of the non-aligned movement, which our young people don't understand. The Young Line movement began in Yugoslavia with Tito to say to the two superpowers, we want to control our resources for the benefit of our people. It is that philosophical underpinning which is absent today in Ghana now that we've found oil. Burnham was a passionate supporter of the non-aligned movement started in 1961 when the other political leader in Ghana was lukewarm about supporting that movement. It was Burnham, for example, who had erected in Georgetown the busts of the non-aligned leaders, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, Nehru of India, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. Burnham was able to survive many attempts to destabilize him. And I recall, as General Secretary of the party, we had prepared a special banquet and arrangement to welcome Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana to our independence celebrations in 1966, the 26th of May. But because Nkrumah didn't have the skill and security network that Burnham had, on his way to find peace in Vietnam, as he arrived in China, obviously instigated by a certain superpower, he was overthrown in early 1966 and therefore could not attend our independence celebrations. I give that as an introductory remark. That Burnham had his weakness. He was an impatient man. He couldn't wait for us to catch up. But he had that ability as commander-in-chief of the party and government to identify who should lead which battalion. And that, I think, is a skill that we should not ignore. And Burnham recognized that a small country of less than 1 million people need also to have a magnificent foreign affairs policy. And consistent with what I just said, he had in foreign affairs some of our great Guyanese, Selina Locke, Shuhita Ramphal, who's still alive, Bishop Talbot, Rashi Jackson, still alive, and a whole group of men who made Ghana proud in spite of a very strong, racially promoted opposition. But I pause for the time being to allow others to speak, and there's so much more I can talk about Forbes Burnham.
And certainly you will get a chance, Hammy. Let me turn to Vincent. And Vincent, let me ask you this question. Talk to us about what Burnham's life tells Guyanese today about the path that Guyana's walked. I know I'm challenging you here, right? What does Burnham's life tell us in 2022 about the path that Guyana's walked? Vincent.
Thank you very much, David. And first thing I'd say about Burnham's life is Burnham came from a very humble beginning. There are people who will tell you that Burnham actually used to sell cow's milk as an activity to enable payment for his tuition. The first lesson, therefore, one can see is that an ordinary person, in terms of economic circumstances, if he or she endeavors and puts his shoulders to the wheels, the sky is the limit. So in that regard, even though not alive, Burnham can be a mentor of Guyanese, and in fact has been a mentor to many Guyanese who have followed his footpath. They have come from humble beginnings. They have studied with lantern lights and things like that, but were able through their commitment and their dedication and their ambition to move from those humble beginnings and to be able to achieve greater heights. Second thing about Burnham's life that I would mention is that there are many people who cannot handle success. When they are successful, particularly in terms of their social mobility, they tend to snub and disregard and frown on people who are at a place where they came from, as if to suggest that to relate to those people will kind of pull them down. Burnham came from where he came from, ascended, but never lost that common touch. And as a leader, was able to continue to relate to people who were having an experience that he would have lived. He didn't have mere sympathy for people. He had empathy and understanding. And I dare say that much of what he did was in a response to his understanding of poverty and deprivation and the desire, having himself overcome those things, to give others the opportunity to overcome them. So that's another thing that one could very much learn from Burnham, that one must have a helping hand to those who may need one's assistance. Another thing about Burnham, which a lot of people don't give credence to, is his recognition of the reality of Guyana as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural society. It is hardly ever mentioned that Burnham returned to Guyana and was invited into the process of the formation of the People's Progressive Party. That is a significant moment we do not pay sufficient attention to, which if we pay attention to, we'll understand the reality of Guyana. Burnham was not invited to the People's Progressive Party to be in its formation only because he was bright and successful a scholar. He was invited because of the recognition that Guyana was a plural society, and that if we were to move forward, we had to have a relationship between the ethnic groups that would allow for cohesion, for unity, and for us to be able to move forward. So there are two lessons to be learned there. It helps us to recognize that our society was, and I dare say, still is a plural society. It helps us to recognize that there were those persons who, having recognized the plurality, sought to find a solution to that plurality. And one of the things they sought to do was the formation of a political party that would represent the mass of Guyanese, hence the involvement of Burnham. Today, there are many who want to deny that reality, and as a consequence, they are not addressing the problems that we face with. They don't understand the landscape that we are on, and therefore cannot propose solutions to our problems. That's another element of Burnham. Not only was he symbolic of the act of unity and cohesion in attempt, but he himself demonstrated respect for and appreciation of all Guyanese. It is through that demonstration of respect and appreciation of that he welcomed other Guyanese of other ethnicities to a party which people consider to be dominated by people of African descent. We welcomed them on merit, that they could bring something to the process of development. And here again, we see another quality of Burnham. He had that ability to identify persons for their skills and to provide them an opportunity to apply their skills to the growth and development of Guyana. And it didn't matter what was the ethnicity. He sought on the basis of merit to involve, be it the Ramphals, the Shahabuddins, the Ramsarups, and many others, because he thought they could make a significant contribution. Not only that they could make a contribution, but that in a plural society, one could not exclude people who represented a particular ethnic group, and all ethnic groups had to be involved. And in that involvement, again, something we don't give recognition to, Burnham reached out to the Amerindians as well and provided an opportunity for an Amerindian to be one of the first Amerindians to become a parliamentary secretary in this country. Burnham also, having himself been a beneficiary of education, respected the importance and the role of education, and in the context of the plural society, did all that he could do at his time to extend the opportunity for education to people, indigenous people. There are those who say all sorts of things today, as if these are things happening for the first time. But we need to recall that Burnham introduced first it was the Amerindian scholarships, and then it became the hinterland people scholarships, where people from the hinterland who could not access secondary school at that time in the hinterland were brought to Georgetown, were housed with families, and were allowed to access secondary and subsequently higher education. It is Burnham's recognition of the rights of those people, his appreciation. And so one could see that whatever he did sought to bring together Guyanese of all ethnic groups into one kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope which was best manifested in the way in which he dealt with things cultural, the way in which he fostered the national holidays in recognition of. You know, I saw somebody writing the other day and talking about Indians not getting certain kinds of recognition. Burnham was the one who introduced ethnic, religious, cultural holidays, reflecting the reality. There's really no ethnic holiday as such for people of African descent because of their reality in Guyana. You have Emancipation Day, and that's an important day. But the Indians have their religious practices and rights and so on. He recognized that, and they got ethnic holidays. So when one talks about Burnham, one talks about somebody who was complete, who was multifaceted in his approach and understanding of life and things around him. He was indeed a reflection of the Guyanese society at large in terms of the kind of policies he pursued, in terms of the kind of relationships he pursued. Burnham recognized that nation building had to do with the building of institutions, that those institutions were reflective of the nation at large. And one of the very good examples that one cannot deny was the National Insurance Scheme. A scheme which was not beneficial to African Guyanese as opposed to the Indian Guyanese, was beneficial to every Guyanese. And therefore, that's the kind of institution one had to create if one wanted to foster unity and one wanted to foster development of Guyana. And I can't leave out the National Service, because the National Service, again, was an important institution that sought to ensure that though we lived in enclaves, that we could find some common space where we could come together to learn to live with each other, to learn of and about each other, and therefore to foster the possibility of ensuring we could work together, although we will ensure that we did not interfere with diversity. And so things like the holidays I mentioned before, the recognition of various religions, was an acceptance of diversity. But the coming together in a place like national service is the acceptance of the need for us to appreciate each other, to work collectively, and to respect each other. If we are really to carefully study all that Burnham did, all that he did easily becomes greater than the things he's accused, the negative things he's accused of doing. And the nation would be far better off if we embrace, understood, and continued the work of Burnham as he has passed and could no longer, for those who think he's done wrong, do us any wrong, but has bequeathed to us a legacy that can continue to make a difference to Guyana. Whether it's a difference in the search for oil, or it's a difference in encouraging people to be involved in agricultural activities, whether it's a difference to teach us to buy local and eat local, a difference that allows us to have respect internationally. There is much we can learn from his legacy that can take us forward. And I close in saying that there are those who subtly, indeed, do try to do some of the things that he did without giving recognition to him for the lessons that they have learned, even if they're misusing those lessons today.
Vincent Alexander there, putting Burnham in context, enumerating some of the achievements of Burnham while in government and making a plea for the lessons to be learned, or the lessons from Burnham's stewardship of Guyana could be useful to us today. Let's bring in young Dwayne Benjamin, who's a lecturer at the University of Guyana. Dwayne, you have to come into contact with young students. Burnham died in 1985, and we live in the Caribbean, we live in a Guyana in which we are not always conscious of a history that is not instant and is not present. If your students were to ask you, why should they be studying Forbes Burnham at the university, what would you tell them?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines, for having me. And in response to your question, why should anyone be, or should anyone study Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham? And it's a very good question, and it's a question that's worth giving a thought. Now, if we examine Burnham's life history from the period in which he was born in 1923 to the period of his death in 1985, and I must say that I lived a few years during the era of Burnham, I would describe Burnham in two words: a builder of nation and an architect. And let me explain. Because when you look at the period of which he was born in 1923 says a lot. Burnham would have lived through the period of the working class struggles. He would have lived through the period, in fact, the period of the different constitutional changes taking place in our society that was basically designed in some cases to reinforce foreign control over our state. But at a very young age, he went and studied in England at a time when Winston Churchill was replaced by Clem Attlee. And that was very significant because we're talking about shortly after the end of the Second World War, where the Minister of Social Development, who had responsibility for education and other things, came came into power in England. And that period was significant because this is where, in my opinion, the grooming or rather the grooming of a young Burnham would have been taking place. So you would have seen the welfare state system and how it operated in England. But more so, he was very instrumental in the establishment of the West Indian Student League, which was an organization that was devoted towards the advocating for the cause of West Indian students, not only Guyanese, but West Indian students. So it is no surprise that on his return, some of the things he wanted to do, like, for example, independence. For him, he defined independence as just one of the political revolution. Another political revolution he saw was ownership of our resources. Some people refer to it as taking control of the commanding heights of the economy, which is the nationalization program. But let me talk a bit about the nationalization program, because I think that is one of the areas that people tend to want to attack Burnham. The point about it is that the intellectual currents of the time in most third world countries, and you would have known also that even within the Caribbean space, we had what was known as the New World Group that were advocating things like import substitution, advocated nationalization, and all these different radical approaches that would have seen a country departing from the norm of the colonial economy and attempts to basically break new ground and to complete their independence. And this is what Burnham saw as a political revolution, which his understanding meant transferring the resources from foreign ownership into local ownership. And that was a very significant thing, because what it was basically, in hindsight, what it was attempting to do basically was to create a Guyanese class of business people, and also attempts to distribute wealth to the persons who otherwise would have been excluded by virtue of that of the status quo that existed at the time. And if you read Tyrone Ferguson's book, Survive Sensibly or to Quote Hero Death, he spoke about the circumstances that Burnham came and met. And he talks about the different segregations in the society, which more so we talking about some of those very things that he spoke about then. We can see it now. Firstly, you have an economy that was essentially in foreign ownership, and that foreign ownership transcended into a particular elite kind of lifestyle, where you have the owners of the bauxite industry, of the sugar industry, and others living in gated communities. Whereas the ordinary Guyanese, be it Afro or Indo-Guyanese, live in a totally different way. In fact, in most of the depressed housing areas, whether in Georgetown or in the coastal areas, that is the places where most of the ordinary Guyanese reside. So the point about it is that the privileged status that was given to foreigners within the economy, within the society, gave them an lifestyle that was totally different from the masses. Now, the thing in countries such as Cuba and elsewhere, you'd have seen revolutions that sought to bring a change to those. But in Guyana, it was totally different, thanks to the leadership of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, who basically, once he became Prime Minister in 1964, one of the first things he sought to do was to change that. And in changing that, 6 years after independence in 1966, 4 years after in 1970, we had Guyana be declared the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And that cooperative word was very significant. because it was building on a tradition that was practiced in African communities, as well as a tradition also that came to exist during the period of indentureship going forward, that where the people at the bottom, the oppressed people, learn to share their resources and pool their resources in order to help themselves up in or to improve their situation out of poverty and to empower themselves. So that the cooperative republic, the naming of Guyana the cooperative republic was very significant. As he himself also said, that republic was one of the other political revolutions. But going beyond that, we had a 1972-76 development plan, which was the second development plan that sought to expand housing, basically provide housing for the vulnerable people as well as for most people in the society. There were efforts aimed at expanding food production, and food production was expanded as a way of cushioning the impact of rising prices globally. But also there were efforts made at clothing, setting up a textile factory, and cotton estates in Kimbia and elsewhere. So that the point about it is that all of these programs are taking place, and like I said, he was involved in the business of building a nation, and part of that business involved putting the institutions in place. Um, um, Mr. Alexander would have talked a bit about some when he mentioned the national insurance scheme. But I think some of the most significant of those were Guy Bank, which is Guyana Agricultural.
And then we will come to a lot of that later on.
Yes.
Let's do something here. Let's let our audience listen to Burnham in his own voice. And this was his last recorded press conference before he prematurely died in 1985. So I'll ask the operator to cue up that interview and let us get a little hear of Mr. Burnham himself.
Or commodities. The IMF program, in fact, in our judgment, would bring about certain unwelcome social consequences, such as we have seen in the Dominican Republic, such as we've seen in many countries in South America. Now, as I understand it, the World Bank does not give funds in support of balance of payments. The World Bank's disbursements are project-oriented. We have been able to get a number of loans from the World Bank for particular projects like a large forestry project up the Demerara River. I think electricity and also bauxite. That we have shown, according to the World Bank statistics, a growth of 5% during 1984 is indicative of what we have been able to do without IMF support.
Mr. Burnham. Starting to bring to this heads of government conference, are you satisfied now that the discussions have finished?
Well, there is only one particular issue which was of a Guyanese nature, which I brought to the conference, and that is the failure of many of the CARICOM territories to buy Guyana's surplus sugar instead of buying Dominican Republic sugar. Otherwise, my concerns and issues, I would say, were regional. So far as was possible and practical, I am satisfied with the results of the summit just concluded.
Mr. Burnham, the question of sugar. Many countries are saying that Ghana sugar is too expensive. It's something like 4 times the world price. Have these allegations been true?
That's not an allegation. Your multiple may be wrong, but your principle is right. But you must understand the background to it. When Guyana in 1974 and 75 was getting 650 pounds per ton, and those were not the weak pound that we know today, Guyana agreed on a formula which led Guyana to sell sugar to Caribbean deficit countries at a much lower price. Our argument is that it's a give and take world. When we could get 650 pounds a ton, we sell it much cheaper to our CARICOM brothers. Now that the bottom has fallen out of the world market price, it is only fair that we get the same price, because we lost millions of pounds selling sugar at the lower price in 74 and 75.
Sir, it's at a rough time economically now. Isn't it a bit difficult asking the CARICOM countries to take expensive sugar at a time like this?
It is not expensive sugar. It is sugar which covers the cost of production. There are many Caribbean products which Guyana purchases, which are more expensive than their alternatives from other sources.
Can you give any examples, sir?
Steel from Trinidad, for instance. And it seems to me that the purpose of a common market, sell it cheap. And when the price of sugar is low, to have no market. And the price at which we contend our sugar should be bought, though there is some flexibility, is a price that was agreed. It is not a price imposed by Guyana.
Burnham himself in 1985. Burnham is dealing in that interview with the IMF and the World Bank. That was on the eve of the end of the Cold War and the coming into being of structural adjustment and globalization. Burnham is dealing in that interview with the challenges of regional integration. Significantly, Burnham in that interview is dealing with sugar, something that we are still contending with today. Let me move this discussion to another level. Hami introduced the Cold War as a significant development if we're going to understand Mr. Burnham and his generation. And I've listened to all 3 of our guests here tonight, and they've all talked about Mr. Burnham's achievement. None of those things that Mr. Burnham did, he invented. I think to understand Burnham and understand all the others of his generation is to understand how they dealt with the challenges. Because all of those things that Burnham implemented, they were implemented against challenges. The challenge of the Cold War, the challenge of turning a nation, turning a plantation into a nation, not easy. You're talking about turning a monoculture economy that produced everything for centuries for other people's consumption and nothing for itself. To understand Burnham, you have to understand that. Young brother talk about nation building. You're building a nation out of plantation. To understand Burnham, I think you have to understand the challenges of ethnic division in Guyana. no matter how we nice it up, right? Europeans came here and tried to take away and did take away Amerindian lands. They brought Africans against their will, and they turned Amerindians into slave catchers of Africans. They brought Indians and Chinese and Portuguese as compensation for the slave owners, giving them indentureship as a compensation. Those who came as indentures wrongly believed that they were coming to rescue this sugar industry that Black people had walked away from because they're lazy. The point I'm making is that no matter how we nice it up, our ethnic groups came here in conflictual circumstances. And if you are going to build a nation, how do you deal with that deep-seated ethnic conflict? Cold War, monoculture economy, turning that into a nation. Conflict. Burnham is also governing at a time when young people who are the products of an indigenous education are challenging the governmental leaders and are saying, you all are not taking independence far enough. Young man they mentioned the New World Group, talking about what Gordon Rowley called the sons, the Tim Hectors and Walter Rodneys and so on, who got their education because of the opening up by their fathers of educational opportunities. They come back and they're challenging their fathers. I'm saying, if we are to understand Burnham, let's understand, try to understand what Burnham are doing against the challenges, external challenges, internal challenges, all right? The Burnhams of that generation, the Burnhams, the Barrows, the Williams, they have to navigate a situation that wasn't easy. In Trinidad, they almost overthrew Eric Williams because they told him, you wrote capitalism and slavery. You radicalize us. We don't think you're radicalizing the political economy enough, and they moved against him in the 1970s revolution. The Rodneys and the WPS moved against Burnham. The Morris Bishops moved against Gary. The Tim Hectors moved against Byrd. I'm putting to you, gentlemen, that for us to, I want us to talk about Burnham against those challenges. You see, that nationalization was supported by the PPP, by the Young Turks in the WPA, but they opposed Burnham. How help us understand the problematics of nation building. All right. I think to understand the value of the Burnham generation is to understand the challenges they face. Because if we look today, in 2020, 2021, 2022, as Guyana again becomes part of geopolitics, and we look at the leaders who are navigating the contradictions and the challenges of the contemporary society, all right, we find them wanting. The essence, I think, of leaders is not the good things that they did, but how they achieve those things against the challenges they face, all right? And when I hear Vincent talking about what we could learn from Burnham, what do the present leaders who are faced, once again, with the challenge of a global community that is trying to determine what happens in a small country, and the challenges of ethnicity and race have raised their heads once again, and the challenges of the elites in the society trying to determine what happens in the society once again. It seems to me challenges of the Burnham era are coming back again, and our leaders are found wanting. And I would think if those leaders were to go back study the Burnham era, they may learn a few things about nation building against the odds. I just wanted to throw those 2 cents in to come back to you guys. Having said all that Burnham did, let's now put it in, as they would say in academia, problematize it, right? It is not everywhere. They nationalize all over the world, all over Africa. What nationalization in Guyana? What were the challenges that Burnham faced in nationalizing that makes nationalization something that we can celebrate today? Ami, you're the old tiger here. So I leave the floor open to you guys against the background of those few remarks by me. Go ahead, Ami. You have to turn your volume on.
Sorry?
Yes, we're now hearing you.
The challenges were monumental. And if I may backtrack, Burnham understood with a population of less than 1 million people, but with resources, we needed the support of our CARICOM people from the very onset. He recognized the challenges of the superpowers, particularly those who believe that the Creator gave them the right to govern this part of the world. And you recall that even before either of the states achieved their political independence, the 3 great Bs, Burnham, Byrd, and Barrow, met at Dickinson Bay in Antigua to create the foundation for CARICOM, so that we will speak not as a single voice in the backlands of Guyana, but speak as a larger group with resources and a passion to make independence.
Let me stop you there for a minute because I forgot the regional integration thing. But as you speak about Burnham and integration, I want you to put it within the context, one, of the failure of the federation, a federation that the PPP did not take Guyana into, so that Guyana was outside of the regional integration movement. In comes Burnham. Burnham is trying to get into the regional movement against the wishes of half of the political community in Guyana, which are kept out of the federation. Go ahead now and talk about Burnham and regional integration, why it was so important what Burnham was doing. Not careful.
The audio isn't too clear, but that's why I began by saying it was a monumental movement encouraged by Burnham. It was to educate not only the Guyanese, but the region as to what we required, so that with that knowledge, we could agitate for better conditions in a very troubling environment. And that, to my mind, was an effort to liberate the people of Guyana and the region. It was not easy sailing because Burnham confronted both within and without those who set out to ensure that we fail and that we become real new colonialists. They did not understand the significance of independence and the challenge Burnham had, particularly in a polarized society, agitated by this ugly thing called race. It was not easy. Remember that the head of Booker's when Burnham nationalized, and he got support of Jagan when they called him critical support. He promised the world that we not sell a thimble full of bauxite. This was a powerful man in the European environment. So that it was that easy, particularly in circumstances when the difficulty of the oil crisis loomed just about that same time. Even supporters of the PNC felt that the stress, felt that the sacrifices required were a little too much. Burnham had to navigate between those treacherous waters and difficulties. And it was not easy. And even among some of our supporters, there were difficulties. People wanted to have imported things, while Burnham said, let's produce, let's feed, clothe, and house the nation using our resources, using our cassava bread instead of wheaten flour bread, using our ground provision, which a cardiologist tell you are better than bringing wheaten flour. These were the challenges, and I began by saying that Burnham was an impatient man and didn't allow the time for ordinary mortals to catch up with his ideas and his vision before the new Guyana man. And that, I began by saying, that was his great weakness.
Vincent, let me bring you in here to further problematize Burnham, putting him in that larger context of external and internal challenges. But I want you also to speak to this issue of race in a broader context. You gave us all the things that Burnham did for all the other races. What did Burnham do for Black people? That was not part of your thesis. And I want you to go there, all right? Because I think the measure of a leader is not just what he did for other ethnic groups. I think that's great. But how you do for your group in a plural, hostile society that will call you a racist if you do for your group. How did Burnham grapple with that? Over to you, Mr. Alexander.
I want to use three instances which are personal to exemplify Burnham and how he dealt with issues. The first one I want to deal with was in 1975. 1975, I was away studying. And at that time, the PNC had embarked on the socialist path, and they were to have a special Congress. And those of us who were away studying decided to send to that Congress revolutionary greetings. We said these wouldn't be ordinary greetings, they'd be revolutionary greetings. Do you imagine sending greetings to Congress made up of 55 pages? 55 pages. And in those greetings, we criticized almost everything in Guyana, ourselves being a part of the People's National Congress. We criticized the salaries of people like Arthur Chung and the fact that they drove in fancy cars and all of that. Almost everything. Subsequently, some years, I was driving my car and my thoughts overcame me and I jumped a major road. Because I simply wasn't driving anymore, I was thinking. And a simple thing like that awakened me to the fact that people who are in certain offices sometimes require certain facilities if they're to function properly. As so-called revolutionaries, we were critical of those things. We said it was bourgeois and all of that. And I'm giving that example to show that Burnham had to deal with young people who were radical, probably sometimes romantic, in a way that he was able to keep them on board, but at the same time, to be conscious of the kind of environment that he had to create for those who were in office, and to try to marry the young and radical with the so-called elite to get a balance, which if we did not get, would not have lent to an environment for growth and development. So that's a very simple, mundane example, but it told me a story about how he had to be confronting the radical young people, allowing them to continue to be revolutionary in their thoughts, but at the same time not allowing them to destroy the fabric which was necessary if you were to operate in a way that would allow contributions of everyone in the development process. The second personal instance I want to refer to was one which took place in 1972. 1978. There was this World Festival of Youth and Students in Cuba. And Burnham was able to provide resources for the YSM and the PYO to collectively attend that festival in 1970. I had a responsibility to identify young people from the YSM to attend that festival. And in that process of doing that, Burnham scolded me that we were not doing enough to ensure that our Indian brothers and sisters were a part of that delegation. Notwithstanding the fact that we had a quota which initially gave the PPP half the delegates and the YSM another half, and the PPP's half consisted of about 98% Indo-Guyanese. I can identify the two Afro-Guyanese I remember who attended. Beaton, at the time, who was Chedi's security, and my good friend Takumo Ogonse.
That's why I'm laughing.
Who was with the WPA, and who you wouldn't believe today how they speak about him, worked assiduously with the PPP against the Burnham regime. That was the situation. And Burnham accosted me and said to me, I didn't seem to understand the reality of Guyana, and that Guyana was a multi-ethnic society. And although the YSM was largely an Afrocentric body in terms of its composition, and I had to reach out to Indo-Guyanese to ensure that they were represented, although they were represented by the PPP in terms of the delegation they carried. He confronted us. He confronted us and gave us direction. The other incident had to do with Brazil. It may or may not be known that in the 70s, Brazil had a dictatorship. And the progressive world thought we should not relate to Brazil. The PPP thought we should not relate to Brazil. They were critical of Burnham for having a relationship with Brazil at that time. And very quietly, at the level of our youth organization, we were made to understand the nature of geopolitics. And that on one hand, it was not our policy to interfere in the internal affairs of a particular country, but that in the specific instance of Brazil, that their relationship with Guyana was critical to our border strategy. That since Brazil had an integral interest in the borders between Guyana and Venezuela, which would shift Brazil's borders with Venezuela, that if we embrace Brazil in one way or the other, with our lack of military capacity, what we were doing was embracing a state that had a military capacity that would cause Venezuela to think twice before they moved against Guyana militarily. So that there was a lot of integral understanding of realities that led to the way in which Burnham had to make decisions. There were minefields he had to traverse in making those decisions, but in making those decisions, he was guided all the time by certain objectives and certain ideals. The objective of a multiracial society being able to work cohesively, and notwithstanding the fact that he may not have gotten the majority of Indian votes, he still reached across and said to us, the African Guyanese, no, those are your brothers and sisters, they're of Guyana, and anything Guyana has to involve them, irrespective of where they may be in terms of a relationship with him. And so, in response to what you asked, I've just attempted to give 3 examples of
Yeah.
complexity of the man in decision making that reflected a real concern for the nation. And it's important that we do that because very often people isolate things that Burnham did and tend to say that he did those things because he was opportunistic and he wasn't well intended and things like that. But if one were to look holistically at the various things he did, one can get a picture of the true man. On the ethnic front, interesting. I think what Burnham essentially did on the ethnic front in the first instance was to articulate national policies that took into consideration the state of the people of African descent. So those national policies were not discriminatory or exclusory of other people, but took into consideration the state of the people of African descent. And so, for example, when you talk about free education, when you talk about scholarships, the people who were at many points in time most disadvantaged in relation to those things were the people of African descent. So in making those, dealing with national policy on those matters, he provided opportunities that the people of African descent may not have otherwise been able to have, but not to the exclusion of other people. That's very important for one to understand. In terms of a big thing about any group of people is self-recognition and self-realization. And when Burnham sought to establish the cooperatives, what the cooperatives provide for, again, not to the exclusion of anyone, he didn't exclude people from the cooperatives, it was a matter of choice, but he provided the African Guyanese an opportunity to pool their resources in an environment where they were the ones with least access to resources, so that they could have a meaningful engagement in what Burnham described as a trisectoral economy. People tend to forget that, trisectoral. Yes, there was nationalization in the public sector, and the nationalization was something that was backed by everybody, and in fact, Jagan was far more radical on the question of nationalization than Burnham was. Burnham's initial position was to control the commanding heights, not to own them, to control them. Jagan, on the other hand, was the one who talked about owning them. And it's only when Burnham was confronted with the reluctance of the Denver and those other companies to facilitate control that he used the weapon which he had, and that was to nationalize and got the support of Chile to do those things. So that was one of the trisectoral economy. Then the private sector was there as well, and we have today in this country companies that have survived that period. You know, I can be bold to say that Tulsi Prasad survived that period, private sector. Kissoon survived that period. Maserati survived that period. So that there's a reality of the private sector even at that time. And then the cooperatives, which were to facilitate the ordinary man. And let me say this about the cooperatives. You know, I listen to people trashing these days. And let me go to the housing sector. Well, Burnham didn't the housing sector. Burnham realized that people of African descent may not have been able to face the banks. He provided an opportunity through the cooperative movement for people to be involved in communal and cooperative activity to build their homes, in a sense subsidized by the state because they were given time off from their own jobs to build houses during what essentially was their working time without a cut in pay. The land was not transported to the people. The land was given to the co-op society. It meant that the people did not have to go and face the bank. Because even now they have problems facing the bank.
Yeah.
So they could join the co-op society. The society then was responsible for the debt, whichever debt they had. And they, over time, would pay the co-op society and would acquire the house without having to find collateral, which would have excluded them from being able to get a house. I want to emphasize that whilst this provided an opportunity for people of African descent, he did not do it to the exclusion of others. Others could have done exactly the same, as some of them did do, as is the case in Lenora, where there's that housing scheme, to benefit from those policies that Burnham introduced. So on the front of education, which he considered very important for the individual development and emancipation, he made opportunities available and away from his empathy, from his own experience. Lots of people don't know that Burnham had to initially pay to go to Central High School. And it was only because of his brilliance that he was able to pass the relevant exams to go to QC. And he had to pass those exams 3 times to continue to be in QC. So he understood the plight and therefore emphasized free education.
Go ahead. And Vincent, I'm so glad you mentioned the nationalization thing, because I think it's a demonstration of how complex country Guyana is. Not only he had Dragon, who was to the left of him on nationalization, he had Askria, which was to the left of him on nationalization. So he was dealing with Dragon externally and dealing internally with Askria. And in those days, you know, the membership of Askria PNC overlapped. Right? Askria to the left. And then you had that small, brown-skinned Portuguese middle class who didn't want nationalization. So you have to deal with them. So when we talk about Burnham and nationalization, we make it look as though it was an easy sailing. But as you have demonstrated, it was not easy sailing, because Guyana is a complex society, even more complex than our CARICOM brothers and sisters, because we have the layer there of ethnicity and race to deal with, which makes Burnham's achievements even more significant because of the challenges externally. Burnham is socialist, but he is to the right of the communist Jagan, and he's having to manipulate and maneuver that delicate ideological situation. I am Marxist, Leninist, not communists. You know, anyhow, I know you have to go, Vincent, but I'm coming to you, Dwayne. Vincent, what can I is up against it again? External intervention, ethnic hardline. Again, this time, unlike the Burnham era, we have wealth. Burnham didn't have too much wealth to share around. That's another challenge he had to deal with. But we're now up against it. We are right back into the ethnic conflict, into external intervention, into geopolitics. What can we learn from Burnham to help us navigate the present situation?
I like the word navigate, because as you spoke, what occurred to me is that Burnham was able to navigate a minefield. That is what he was able to do. He was able to, and this is what we should be trying to do now. Burnham sought, in the first instance, to see to what extent he could unite the Guyanese people. Because uniting the Guyanese people meant that out of our unity and our consciousness, we would be in a mental state, as the Cuban people have been for decades, to confront these problems, even though it may mean some hardship for us. Because in that complex situation, including foreign powers with nationalization, it meant that there was going to be pushback. And what's critical about pushback is that people are united, conscious and united, and therefore prepared, given their understanding that what is being done in the medium to long term would be beneficiary to them, whilst they pay a price in the short term. And so I think the critical thing we are faced with is, one, uniting our people. But you can only unite the people if you have an appreciation for and understanding and respect for the various groups in a manner, then uniting them, you bring to bear that understanding and that respect that will allow them to be involved in what may be called an equitable manner. We are not all equal, and therefore there has to be a certain degree of equity that allows for us to dovetail into one as we seek to confront the issues which are confronting the nation. What we are faced with is a situation where we are not seeking to unite in reality. We are giving preference to some people over others, both from the standpoint of class in one instance, the private sector versus the rest, and from the standpoint of ethnicity in another instance. And class and ethnicity are interwoven, and we must bear that in mind. When we talk about class, we're talking about how people of Indian descent, African descent, indigenous people are all affected. But at the same time, how psychologically, they may not be of the class which affects them. And therefore, although you're appealing to them, they are being appealed to from another perspective. And so one has to find a way to marry the ethnic groups as you seek to look after their class interests. That was a great challenge, which in some regards in the past was handled by our trade union movement. I'm not quite sure that is happening today. David, I really haven't completely answered the question, but I am faithful.
But I know you have another engagement, but thank you for bringing that perspective. Dwayne, let me get you in here. I'm not going to ask you any specific question. You've heard Vincent, you've heard Hami, you've heard me. What can we take from Burnham to help us in this critical era that we are in?
Dr. Hines, you're right. I think the other panelists have answered that question in a sufficient manner. There are a number of things that Burnham had done in the past that I think sought to address those very problems. Um, and the international relations front, he established the non-aligned movement, um, even getting involved in regional integration, which gives Guyana a bigger voice in the global arena, as well as ensure that Guyana has those networks of countries that supports her cause. And we see it played out in a number of reactions to Venezuela on the border issue. On the domestic front, there are a number of things that he did, included the expansion of education. And while most of the panelists address education, I think they miss a fundamental point about education. And one of the things about that is that education, the curriculum also was redesigned. It was more indigenous curriculum. I think if you went to school in the 80s, you would have known about the Rampat family, Pat and Roy, um, and those literature, coming up, reading about those, which in a sense sought to promote the multi-ethnic cultural space that Guyana is. Um, but also the reforms in education caters for the people with different levels, different kinds of intelligence. So you had the multilateral schools, which case you had the what we call the community high schools, which caters for the people who interested in skills-based type education. You had the multilateral schools, which was more blended, and then you had the regular secondary or high schools, which cater for those persons who was somewhat academically inclined. So you had all of this, and the point about it is that the opportunities were created for all in the society. I don't know if you can recall that it was during the 70s going into the 80s that Burnham, both Burnham and Chetty Jagan initiated a power sharing dialogue, which I think never got far because of the death of Burnham and
That's
subsequently.
85. That's 85. That's
Right,
85.
right. He died in 85, but I think it started somewhere in 82 or thereabout.
85, 85, 85, and Ami can bear me out here. It didn't start in 82. Ami was very much part of that. So be careful with your date. You're dealing with participants.
Yeah.
But David,
Yes, Ami.
David, you posed a question,
Yes,
which is
I'm coming back to you, Dwayne.
difficult.
Yeah.
What did Burnham do for Black people?
I
was a senior person in the party when this question of partition came. We recognized then, and up to this day, that we're dealing with, if I may use the word, different tribes. The manumitted Africans, and this is a difficult one to talk about, was given the Bible as his charter. The other people had a different approach to economics. They were ruthless. They were dealing with matters that we want to forgive about. And Professor Mazuri Ali, at an anniversary here, posed the question that the freed Africans neither use their suffering as a sacred doctrine or a political fund, political economic fund. This is a very serious issue that your question posed. Unless we are prepared to confront it openly and understand that the other people have a different approach to money, economics, and business. And this one is one that I've got myself into trouble with some of our pastors and Christian leaders. In a sense, the theology passed on to our ancestors disabled us from competing on an even keel with other people whose ideology, whose theology is different to ours. This is a difficult one. It's a sensitive one. But unless we face what Missouri said to us, I think on our 75th anniversary, that the African neither use his suffering as a sacred doctrine or as an economic political fund. If we examine this carefully and look through our history, we'll understand A, why the cooperative was important, and why many of us felt at ease when this question of partition came. But on close examination, what facts existed then, we understood that we would have started the race at a disadvantage. The economic race in particular. And the evidence is there. And I think, David, one day we should devote a few hours to discussing this question, invite some of our pastors to talk about it. On Sunday at the church, to talk about Burnham's role, the pastor quite openly said, we must learn to forgive our enemies. Now, I left there a little upset. I grew up, my grandfather was a minister of religion. I grew up in a Christian church. But unless we understand our differences, we'll be in a lot of trouble. I've said this before, David. If you go around Guyana, you see David Hines, who you're talking about, a white or a black man? Hamilton Green, Vincent Alexander. When you hear Prasad sing Chilau, Dinabriga, you know who you're talking about. So that our moorings were destroyed by the plantocracy. And it couldn't be repaired and restored in a few generations. But these are the difficult issues we need to deal with openly and frankly, fearlessly, as we pose that question you raised. What did Burnham do for Black people?
Yeah, I want you to touch on this other issue, and it's a sensitive issue.
On the what?
I want you to touch on this issue because Vincent raised it. Burnham had to deal with radicalism inside of the PNC coming from the YSM, the young.
Yes.
He had to deal with the radicalism force of Astoria, and then later on the WPA. Burnham himself would have been radical for his generation, but here is this new radicalism, and you are there. You are there with him. Without giving away state secrets, how did Burnham grapple with the meaning of that new radicalism as he's trying to build this nation? He's now confronted by radicalism inside of the party and outside of the party among the intelligentsia, etc.
Well, David, we need that rabid radicalism right now. There's no question about it. The question is, where are our leaders to lead this assault against those who are not shy to re-enslave us economically and otherwise? And this is something we need to discuss openly, fearlessly. We've got to produce a cadre of young people who can face this assault on our character and our future. To face the situation where I listened to a letter, looked at the letter the other day, where I don't remember his name, was recalling Black Friday. And he said that the PNC destroyed Indian businesses in Wall Street. Absolute nonsense. In 1962 February, there were few Indian businesses. But this is the propaganda which is gripping our own people. And our own people believe this narrative that once the Black people rise up, they're bad. Once we stand up for our rights, we're evil. And therefore, as one businessman, Indo-Guyanese businessman, told me 3 weeks ago when I went to a store, he says Black people not going to rise up again. But unless there is some movement to tell satanic forces that enough is enough, we will remain at the bottom of the ladder, to use Jagon's word, and will become the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. It's a very serious matter. And I said to a program last night that even with my failing vision, but I think my brains is still intact, I almost feel compelled to put on back my battle gear. I was at the protest outside of the Marriott, and I didn't like what I saw. I didn't go the first day because I was hoping that His Excellency, the President and the Vice President, will tell us we're going to renegotiate. That didn't happen. So that how many enemies are we facing today? How many people see money as the alpha and the omega of their philosophy? And how many of us have been calmed as they did after slavery by an ideology, a theology, which in my view has disabled us from confronting people who don't share that ideology. It's a serious matter, David, and I would like to join the discussion on it.
Yes.
So we can find answers and move forward.
Hamilton Green saying there was radicalism against Burnham government. Where is that radicalism against this evil today? And I think it's a poignant question. I was a teenager, when I joined the radical movement.
$1 million question, David.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ami.
I've tried to analyze it a few moments ago.
Yes.
But perhaps it goes much deeper than that.
Yes.
Perhaps it is so deep that we require forceps to bring it. And I again refer to what Ali Mazuri said here. I'm sure you was been part of that lecture series.
Yes.
Why have not the Africans sacralized their turned their suffering into a sacred doctrine and an economic resource?
And only recently, I can tell you, Hami, in attempting to do that on this program, Ravidev called me a memory warrior. That is trying.
What did he call you?
Ravidev called me a memory warrior who's trying to use the sacrifice that people make in exactly that, to take our suffering and turn it into something righteous to liberate us. They call me a memory warrior. Right? And I think you're raising the question there where Ali Mazuri raised, a very important question. Any ethnic group, whether the Jews, whether the Palestinians, they turn their suffering into something that advances them economically and spiritually. Dwayne, closing thoughts?
Well, In close, I think there's a lot we could learn from looking at Burnham and his life, and there are lots also that we can gain in understanding the circumstances we are in at the present. So yeah, that's just my closing
Well,
thoughts.
as a young man, let me draw you out there as a young man who's aware of Burnham's contribution. All right. What do you think young people can take from Burnhamism to deal with this very important moment? And I keep stressing that. It is not that history is repeating itself. It is that in our case, when it's repeating itself not at the same level as last time. The thing about the geopolitics in Guyana now is that oil is involved. The last time the external forces intervened, it was over ideology. This time it's over wealth. What is it as a young man who has studied Burnham that you can tell your fellow young people that they can draw from Burnham? I'm not asking you about the bridges that Burnham built. I'm talking about at the level of the intellect, at the level of tactics and strategy.
Well, at the level of strategy, the first thing I think you have to learn, and which is something that Burnham did very well, is to organize and to build institutions that support your cause. And in doing so, it means reaching out and building friendships and networks, whether local or international, that support your cause. And also, it means advocating your rights, advocating for your share of the pie also. At the level of intellect, and this is where I think a lot of young people might be lacking, is that it requires you understanding the changing dynamics of the world in which we live. And it's very interesting because I received a text from a student of mine 5:30 this morning, wondering what is the implications of Ukraine to Guyana. Because the concern seems to be, oh, Russia's invaded neighboring country, Ukraine. What if the Venezuelans doing that? And I had to explain to the person that, if you look at the root of the problems in Ukraine, is Russian people move over to particular provinces in Ukraine and then ask over a period of time through referendum, ask for secession, which it was passed. The referendum did pass that allowed for breakaway republics. And I think that is what the Russian government recognized. And is in that context, the conflict is being intensified. And if you look at Guyana today, we are almost in the same thing, where we have a small population and we have a number of migrants coming from neighboring Venezuela because of the problems over there. So how do we deal with that? How do we manage it? So I think as young people, we have to be conscious of the global environment. We have to also be conscious of our own political environment at home. And, it is heartening to see that the struggles yourself and others within in regards to power sharing. Now we see the US is coming and say, well, Guyana needs inclusive democracy, and it's probably time that we work towards power sharing. Which brings back to the point that I was making before you actually interjected and cut. That Burnham, and as you said in 1985, was approaching the very question of power sharing after recognized, saying that from 1966 to 1985, after 19 years of independence under his government, that he didn't solve the ethnic problem, despite the fact that the policies and some of the programs that he pursued were supposed to be beneficial to all Guyanese. The problems still remain, and he recognized the need to have a different approach. And that is where the power sharing talks between the PNC and the PPP started.
And I dare say, Burnham also recognized that the Cold War was coming to an end, the world was going to change, and so therefore he also had to adjust. and navigate. My point is that that generation, which I have difficulty with as a radical, but that generation believe in something called Guyana. They believe in something called Caribbean. They believe in something called nationhood. They were nationalists. I think if one of the lessons that we learn from Burnham in this present era as we confront the juggernaut of ethnicity and external intervention is nationalism that speaks to a recognition of the times that we live in. Hyper ethnicity with hyper external intervention is what Burnham had faced. And we can learn something of how he navigated that to help us today. Hamilton, you have the last word.
Well, David, we've got a lot of work to do. Burnham's vision was for United Guyana. This must still be our objective. It has to be against the background that each ethnic, social, and religious group understand the contributions each group made to develop this society. And with humility and decency, and that is a characteristic missing these days. Let us hold hands together, confront the giants, because those fellas, if they're speaking to half, they can relax. But if they're speaking to 99% to the whole, they've got to listen. And this too has been my plea. Let us get around the table, like the Knights of the Round Table, and understand that on this newfound all-wealth and new circumstances, the world is different to what it was in the 60s. The Cold War is not a Cold War now, it's a very complex situation. Mm-hmm. And we have got to have the intellectual stamina, grit to work together. As I said, let's educate so we can agitate to liberate our people, all of our people, Indo, Afro, Chino, Mixo, and what have you. Because, as happened before, we still face an external threat to manipulate our resources. And the old imperial technique is alive and well of divide and rule. We've got to put an end to that, and that's my final salvo.
Hamilton Green, Dwayne Benjamin, and Vincent Alexander.
Could I make one point?
Yes, go ahead, Dwayne. Go ahead.
Before we even get to where senior Hammy Green would like us to meet, I think, and going back to, I think, Hammy Green's own proposal, we need to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where we talk about the things that divide us, the old wounds and the sores of the past, and we start anew. That is just my humble cent and in that regard.
And thank you very much for that intervention. I want to thank Hammy. Thank you, Dwayne, for making your debut appearance on Politics 101. I hope you come back soon. And thanks to Vincent Alexander, who's a regular here. This was by no means an exhaustive discussion on Burnham. Burnham was a colossal, and 90 minutes is not enough time to really deal with his contributions in a comprehensive way. In a sense, an analysis of Burnham is really an analysis of Guyana. In the same way, an analysis of Dagon is an analysis of Guyana, an analysis of the supporting cadre, the Guyanas who are still alive, Aston Chase, who are still alive, the Clive Thomases, who are still alive, because those radicals really played a very important role in the developments. Often we talk about the Burnhams and the Williams and the Birds and the Garys, and we don't talk about them within the context of the face down between them and their sons and daughters, right? And how that helped to shape where we are today. Mistakes were made on both sides along the way. But I think Guyana can say that the sons and daughters of political sons and daughters of Burnham, the political sons and daughters of Rodney and Guyana, found themselves in a coalition that took power in 2015. Did we do justice to ourselves? Did we understand the historical meaning of that coalition? The jury is still out on that. Good night. Have a nice weekend. And you know, wherever it's Politics 101, we just don't chat. It's not stink and dirty around here. Serious discussion, analysis, education. See you all next week.
Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.